Welcome back to FreightWaves Now. I'm Anthony Smith here with Kaylee. And Kaylee, we have someone special joining us very soon.
Medically necessary feature today. We've got Matt Blois on the line talking about what's going on. Private company, some interesting news coming out to help with some COVID situations and even some prescription help too. Matt, what's going on?
Yeah, so I wrote about this in the newsletter last week. I thought it was an interesting initiative. It's coming from a company, a nonprofit actually called CivicaRX, and they've basically the whole goal of this nonprofit is they are trying to tackle. I've written about them about their work tackling drug shortages. On generic drugs, but they've recently expanded this program to tackle the problem of generic drugs that are too expensive, which I thought was interesting because it's basically the opposite problem of the drug shortages. Because sometimes the drug shortages happen because basically profit margins are too low and manufacturers don't want to make them, and so generic drugs that have prices that are too high is just sort of an interesting problem that's different that I thought they're doing some interesting stuff to address that as well.
So, Matt, when they're going over this, are they targeting any particular types of drugs? Is there a specific focus, or is it just kind of in general?
Well, so it'll be that's one of the things that I'm really interested to see is they didn't announce basically the thing they announced is they're going to make 6 drugs that are really high priced generic drugs, and they're going to try and sell it at cost. And so most of the time when there's generic drugs that are really high priced, or I don't know, most of the time, but a lot of the time it's diseases, they treat diseases that are super rare. But there are other drugs that are really expensive and for whatever reason have a lot of people who need them. And so I talked to a researcher who looks into this problem, and he was saying he's going to be really interested to see what they choose because it's really interesting to think sort of about the cost benefit calculation there because if it's a drug that's serving more people, you could help more people, but at the same time, if that drug serving more people has an alternative that works, maybe you want to go with the one that has less. And so I just thought it was really interesting to sort of think about all those different factors as they're selecting which drug they're gonna make to try and lower the price.
And so it's Civica RX that's stepping in to kind of help take on this initiative. And as you mentioned, they are a nonprofit. Talk to me a little bit about how rare it is to see a nonprofit kind of step in into this healthcare scene and take over some of the costs, because typically we think of pharmaceuticals and healthcare as kind of this for-profit system, right? If you make a name
hmm
brand drug, you're making money off of that, and it's kind of a waste of a generic, or they make the generic because they don't profit off of it. So talk to me
Yeah.
about how the nonprofit is kind of a unique, I guess, step in for this.
I think it's super interesting because drugs are a weird market that don't behave exactly like other markets where if you don't get the thing that you're looking for, you will die. So that just like throws a wrench into things. Um, but and so the basically the nonprofit versus for-profit one, it really only makes sense in the generic. Like, there's not nonprofit drug companies out there going out and developing new drugs because that's super expensive. But there are these generic drugs that have problems, and in general, it's usually pretty cheap to make those drugs. It's not incredibly difficult, and so I think that's how you're able to see something like a nonprofit go in there because it's the technology's out there, we know how to do it. The problem is there's just not a big market incentive. And so if you sort of take away the market incentive, there's a way to sort of solve the problem. People aren't really making a ton of money off of it, but you can at least make sure that people get the drugs they need to.
So, Matt, we definitely saw a lot of things getting expedited throughout the pandemic. A lot of things were just kind of moved around. There was a lot of speed. Do you see any of those characteristics or trends kind of carrying over to this situation? Do you think there will be any kind of, more speed moving throughout this than there would have been previously, historically?
More speed, as in, I don't think I quite understand that question. You're talking about is there going to be more?
I guess more
Yeah.
speed throughout. So looking at more generic drugs potentially entering, I'm sure there's a lot of
Oh
loopholes to
yeah.
potentially kind of get through from a legal standpoint. Do you see that there might be some more speed or more expedited efforts, kind of making sure that we get to a resolution here, or maybe a little bit more ease of business going on for these producers?
Well, it depends because I think one of the things that the FDA did that was really interesting during the pandemic is one of the ways they sort of dealt with supply chain problems is they expedited a lot of applications to open up new drug production facilities and or make new drugs. And so that's not, as the pandemic wanes, they're probably going to do less of that because that's really focused on COVID-19. So I don't know if it's necessarily going to go a lot faster just on the regulatory side.
Matt, that's what's going on in the newsletter this week for Medically Necessary. What's going up on your podcast this week that's on Thursdays?
So this Friday is actually an interview that I'm really excited about. This is I'm talking to Thomas Tyge, who's the CEO of a nonprofit medical distributor. I guess continue with the nonprofit theme, but I interviewed him a couple weeks ago. But he's nonprofit medical distributor, Direct Relief. So they bring medical supplies to places that need them, like disaster zones, or during the COVID-19 pandemic, I guess the whole world was a disaster zone. So they kind of went all over the world. I wrote about kind of the logistics, sort of their process of getting medical supplies out to India. And so we talked about it on the podcast as well, which I thought was super interesting.
Awesome. Should be a great episode. Make sure that you go catch that. Thank you so much for joining us, Matt. Go subscribe to his newsletter up on FreightWaves.com.